Hello, everyone. My name is Parker Gaunt, and I'm happy to be back again for a discussion board on the evaluation matrix for some DUI collision prevention policies that I'm focusing on in Riverside County. So let's jump right into it. Alrighty, so here is the evaluation matrix that I have for the three policies that I talked about last week. So there is the as-is policy, and then there's the more government policy, which is enhanced DUI enforcement, lowering BAC limits, and then there's the less government policy, which is the voluntary rideshare partnership, where we would give credits to rideshare companies to offer free rides home during peak hours of DUI crashes. So the three criteria that I used are effectiveness, which obviously is required for this assignment, which measures how well each policy is expected to reduce DUI crashes and injuries. The second criteria is political feasibility, which is how likely elected officials are to support and adopt the policies. Even highly effective policies sometimes really don't succeed if they can't get political approval. And then the third criteria is administrative feasibility. This evaluates whether government agencies have the personnel, the funding, the organizational capacity to implement and enforce that policy successfully. So based off of my evaluation, the DUI enhanced enforcement, so the more government option, that scores the highest in effectiveness because there's a lot of research that shows that increasing DUI enforcement, lowering BAC limits, requiring ignition interlock devices, those help reduce DUI crashes. It scores moderate in the political and administrative feasibility because you're requiring new legislation, you're requiring additional funding, and increased enforcement resources. And kind of one of the big hurdles also is that Riverside County does have the Riverside County Sheriff's Department, which is one of the biggest sheriff's departments in the country. However, there are several jurisdictions which don't use that. So you have places like Palm Springs or Cathedral City, which wouldn't use that, meaning you would have to implement these policies independently within those jurisdictions as opposed to one broad sweeping change. So the as-is policy scores high on the political and administrative feasibility because it already exists. You don't need to change anything. And the voluntary rideshare program, that also scores pretty high politically. But it relies on voluntary participation rather than strict regulation, so that could be a pretty big hurdle. So now to compare effectiveness. So I began with the Riverside County's 2023 data, which reported that there was 2,093 alcohol-related crash victims and injuries. So this is our baseline for when we compare these three major policies. So if the current policy is in place, I would expect that number of alcohol-related crashes to remain pretty stable. I wouldn't expect any significant policy changes that are introduced, or so I imagine that it would be pretty stable. So the more DUI enforcement, more government intervention, that's expected to produce the largest reduction in terms of DUI crashes. Now, this policy includes increasing DUI checkpoints, lowering the BAC limit to 0.05% as opposed to 0.08%, and then expanding ignition interlock requirements. You could have that for just single offenders would need them, or you could even implement that as a mandatory requirement in cars, such as a backup camera. Cars have to have a backup camera. You can make it where they have to have an ignition interlock device. So my estimates based off of the several studies that I found, that there was a study in North Carolina that found that the 0.08 BAC limit reduced alcohol-related crashes. There was another similar study in Illinois which found that the 0.08 BAC limit and ignition interlock laws significantly reduce DUI crashes. So based off those findings, I approximately 10 to 15% reduction would occur compared to the current policies. So the less government alternative, which is that rideshare program, which is voluntary, there was a study that was done and it showed that rideshare programs was associated with approximately a 6% reduction in DUI fatalities and crashes. So I expect that option to produce a moderate improvement, but not as large as what an increased enforcement would. Alrighty, so this is the effectiveness rating slide. So this summarizes how effective each policy alternative is. So the current policy is, a moderate rating because it is expected to maintain the baseline, like maintain the current outcomes with little or no reduction in what's occurring. And then if you look at the enhanced enforcement policy, that gets a high effectiveness rating because there are multiple studies that have been done which show that there is effectiveness when it comes to stronger enforcement, lowering those BAC limits, requiring ignition interlock devices. Those help. Those are effective. And then the voluntary ride share program, that would receive a moderate rating because rideshare programs have demonstrated that there is a benefit, but the problem with this program is it would be voluntary, so you're going to get a smaller participation with that, and individuals still have to make that choice to use it. So something like DUI checkpoints or ignition interlock devices, those don't allow you to get past them, but with the rideshare program would still need that clear-headed decision making, which obviously if you're going to drive while you're intoxicated, you don't have. So overall, the research shows that enforcement-based strategies have a greater impact on reducing DUI crashes rather than voluntary ones. And as always, here are my references. Everything I talked about is in here. And thank you all for your time very much. And remember to not drink and drive. And I'll see you guys next week. Have a great one.